Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents the Racial Healing Handbook, practical activities to help you challenge privilege, confront systemic racism, and engage in collective healing. By Anneliese A. Singh, Ph.D., LPC. Foreword by Tim Wise. Afterword by Daryl Wing Sue, Ph.D. Narrated by Machelle Williams. Publisher's Note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type "The Racial Healing" into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code "aggression," and then click the unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All figures and tables referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Visit newharbinger.com/42709 for a downloadable clinician's guide and a downloadable reading group guide for this book. Publisher's Note: this publication is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is sold with the understanding that the publisher is not engaged in rendering psychological, financial, legal, or other professional services. If expert assistance or counseling is needed, the services of a competent professional should be sought. In consideration of evolving American English usage standards and reflecting a commitment to equity for all genders, they and them is used in this book to denote singular persons. The figure Racial Identity Development in Chapter 1 is adapted from the work of Marla Rowe Garoche and Kathy McGrail and John and Joy Hoffman, reproduced by permission of Marla Rowe Garoche and Kathy McGrail. Example of racial microaggressions in Chapter 6 is reproduced from Table 1, Examples of Racial Microaggressions, in Sue D.W. Capodilupo, C.M. Torino, G.C. Useri, J.M. Holder, A.M.B. Nadal, K.L., and Esquilin M. Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Implications for Clinical Practice, American Psychologist. Forward. Confession time. I was late, very, very late, turning in this forward. As in, a few hours before the passing of the absolute final deadline, late. And although I wouldn't normally think my tardiness necessary to mention at the outset of someone else's book, in this instance, the reason for it is entirely related to the subject matter of this important volume. To be specific, for most of December 2018, my family and I were the recipients of an onslaught of hateful phone calls, texts, and tweets from white supremacists who managed to find and release our cell phone numbers and address to the general public, and to threaten harm not just to myself, but also to my wife and 2 daughters. Long story short, after much effort, we have weathered the storm, turned over the harassers' information to the proper authorities, and taken the necessary measures to protect ourselves from future threats. But the bigger question is how we, as a society, and a culture more broadly, can protect ourselves from the poison of white supremacy. Not just in its most blatant iterations, as with the kinds of twisted souls who have spent the better part of a month harassing my family, but even when it comes to a smoother, less obvious package, as it so often does. Or when it carries the power and authority of the state, as with disproportionate police violence or immigration enforcement against persons of color. Because for every white man like myself who has the resources, and frankly the power, to go after the racists who terrorize me and mine, there are literally millions of people of color, especially women of color and LGBTQ folks of color and poor folks of color, who do not. Who carry around the same fears, indeed greater ones than I, but for whom society extends not 1/10 as much sympathy or the kind of response it does for me. Not that society shouldn't respond to hateful racist and anti-Semitic threats like those directed at my family. Of course, it should. But until such a response is the norm, and until people of color can feel safe going to law enforcement to protect them from white supremacists, rather than worrying that law enforcement is but another instrument of white supremacy, this culture will have a lot of work to do. Obviously, at present, we are a long way from that time. That's where this wonderful and vital volume comes in. I have known Anneliese Singh for a little more than 30 years now. Our history is extensive, from anti-apartheid work at Tulane University in the 1980s to fighting for reproductive justice in Louisiana and challenging the political candidacies of neo-Nazi David Duke in the early 1990s. We have been through a lot together. I am ecstatic to call her a friend, a colleague, and a teacher. In this workbook, Dr. Singh teaches us all, myself included, how to truly identify racism, both internalized and systemic, and to take action for justice and equity, and not from a position of guilt or shame, but from one of strength and commitment. Importantly, she shows us the connections between the tortured national history of racism and white supremacy and the issues we face today, illustrating how we have for so long carried the scars of that injury with us and transmitted them like a virus down through the generations. And she reminds us of the harm racism does to all, to people of color as its targets, to be sure, and also to white folks, who wind up as the collateral damage of a system created for our benefit, but which, in the long run, injures us all. Weaving personal, historical, and analytical narratives with dexterity, humility, and compassion, Anneliese shows us a path forward. At a vital moment in the history of the United States and the world, with xenophobic nationalism on the rise throughout the so-called white world, in the U.S. and Europe in particular, and with Trumpism taking long-standing racist tropes and weaponizing them in ways even more blatant than with previous American presidents, there could be no better time for a workbook of this nature. Although the kinds of racism and anti-immigrant hysteria currently being whipped up around the world are hardly new, with modern technology spreading hate faster than ever, and with the global economy leaving hundreds of millions of people behind, the atmosphere for reactionary and even neo-fascist politics, which seek to blame despised others for the problems of unemployment, crime, and other social ills, becomes even more toxic. While many authors and thinkers have weighed in so as to diagnose the problem, fewer have offered up personal and systemic measures one can take in the cause of freedom. That's why I'm so grateful for what Anneliese Singh has provided us in this volume. More than just an exploration of our national and global dilemma when it comes to racism and white supremacy, what the Racial Healing Handbook offers us is a blueprint with practical steps all of us can utilize and deploy to get free from the personal and institutional barriers to racial equality and justice for all. Like Anneliese, this book is resolute and bold, pulls no punches, and fundamentally tells the truth. Both she and the work she has produced here are indispensable to the struggle. It is an honor to know her and to heartily recommend her genius on full display in the Racial Healing Handbook. Tim Wise, anti-racist educator, commentator, and author of White Like Me, Reflections from a Privileged Son, Nashville, Tennessee. Introduction. There are several basic premises of this workbook, the first of which is that our world is steeped in racism. Racism is a system of oppression that relies on beliefs that one race or group of people is superior to another based on biological characteristics like skin color, facial features, and hair. White supremacy, the key driver of racism, designates white people as superior to people of color, which is just not true. There is no one race that is better than another. In the system of racism, white and light-skinned folks are granted unearned privileges or advantages by society just because of their race. For instance, white folks get to see their societal value reflected back to them continuously, from seeing their histories in school textbooks and positive media portrayals, to having the advantages of safe neighborhoods, quality education, high-paying jobs, access to good medical care, and greater health and well-being. Meanwhile, People of color experience a world that does not value them in the same way as it values white people, and they experience a lack of access to neighborhoods, schools, communities, and jobs, which in turn influences the quality of their overall health and well-being. Privileging one group of human beings over another in this way is obviously not fair. A second premise of this workbook is that because we all grow up in a society steeped in racism, everyone learns explicit and implicit stereotyped messages in families, schools, and communities about who people of color and white people are. We end up learning these racialized stereotypes and acting on them consciously and unconsciously without much opportunity to unpack or critique them. In this manner, racism has created, and continues to create, wounds of pain, grief, and loss for everyone in society, both those devalued by racism and those who are in the dominant privileged group. When you internalize and come to believe stereotyped ideas of who other people are and who you are, it becomes challenging to understand how extensively we are all influenced by the context of white supremacy. People of color have their opportunities and lives limited by the barriers they face and the way their experiences and identities are marginalized, and white people find themselves participating in a system in which they gain advantages that, as individuals, they may not have earned. This can lead to feelings of unease and guilt as they see people of color who don't have those advantages, or when they witness overt racism. But so much of racism, especially in the current moment, is systemic, embedded into the structures that surround us, including our schools, governments, legal system, social programs, and more. Consider the following examples. School systems continue to use textbooks that center the history of white people, and when it comes to high school completion, Black and Latinx students have lower rates than their white peers, likely due to racist school environments and differential access to educational supports and resources. People of color have little representation in the U.S. federal government. At the time of this writing, the House of Representatives is 75% white, and the U.S. Senate is 90% white. Black and Latinx Americans make up 32% of the U.S. population, yet they constitute 56% of people who are incarcerated. Asian and Pacific Islander Americans, who are U.S. citizens, are consistently asked where they were born, implying that they somehow are perpetually foreign to the United States. Native American, First Nation, Indigenous people see their images used as mascots for sports teams, which is a denigration of their culture. These are just a few examples of the widespread racism in our society, privileging one group, white people, while disadvantaging another group, people of color. So while racism does exist, as a society we don't tend to have regular conversations about it, aside from social media posts and occasional town hall meetings, which is partly why it is hard to figure out what racism is when it is happening and what to do about it. On the one hand, you may be able to identify racism when it is happening, like when a family member, friend, or colleague makes a racist comment or joke. On the other hand, you might not know how to respond or interrupt this person, leaving you with a range of feelings such as guilt, anger, fear, and sadness. Or you may feel that you are the target of the racist joke or comment and feel too stunned and shocked to respond. Racism can be truly overwhelming in our interpersonal interactions. But as extensive and overwhelming as racism can be, there is a third premise of this workbook: that you can begin healing from racism through changing your individual actions and interpersonal interactions. When I talk about healing from racism, what do I mean? Healing means you begin to unlearn the stereotyped racial messages you internalized about your own race and the race of others. It means you as an individual learn to recognize the wounds that racism creates in you, whether you are white or a person of color, and whether you are conscious of these nicks and tears to your psyche or not. Healing means you open your eyes to the costs of racism, which are pretty much everywhere, and work to stop participating, either knowingly or actively, in the system of racism and white supremacy that was designed to favor some people and not others. You learn to notice how your race drives the differential privileges and access to needed resources you might receive. The good news is that healing from racism is a process of proactive individual actions and strategies you can practice throughout your lifetime. And the even better news is that as you begin to heal from racism, you can learn to give folks in your personal and professional circles the opportunity to heal from racism too. So as you listen, you will learn a recipe of sorts for individual actions you can take right now to be an active part of dismantling racism, while doing some important healing in the process. These endeavors aren't simple processes that will happen overnight, but they are processes you can start now, so you can be part of a generation of folks who did something about racism together. Getting educated is a key part of ending racism. So let's talk a little more about what racism is and why healing from racism is an integral part of dismantling it. What is racism exactly? To understand racism, you have to understand race and ethnicity. In this workbook, you will see me use the word race as shorthand to describe both race and ethnicity, but there is a difference between them. Race is often defined as a biological construct, such as a shared genetic classification. Ethnicity refers to a group that shares a common or distinct ancestry and cultural practices, generally according to a geographic region and often with psychological attachment. To make it even more complicated, race and ethnicity are just social constructions, elements of a system developed by humans to categorize people who appear to share common features. These constructs can and often do overlap, and often these words, which are frequently used inaccurately and have been scientifically disproven, were designed for racist practices. A good example is the word Caucasian, a common term to describe the race of white people. The term comes from Blumenbach's racial classification system, in which he purported that God created Caucasians in his own image as the ideal race. Then, Blumenbach designated other races that he deemed inferior to describe everyone else, for example, Mongolian, Malayan, and Negroid. Blumenbach's system was later used to justify the enslavement of black people in the U.S., so his social construction of race had lasting effects. But guess what? The term Caucasian is also entirely inaccurate. My very brown and very Indian dad was born near the Caucasus Mountains, and his skin color was the furthest thing you could imagine from being white. So you can see how the word Caucasian is not a helpful or accurate word to describe white people. Nonetheless, white supremacy is real, and the amount of melanin that you have in your skin signals something to the world about the societal norms that will be applied to your presumed race. For instance, there are societal norms, the vestiges of colonization and enslavement practices, that value light skin over dark skin. In other words, these societal norms promote messages that whites are the ideal race, which then puts folks of color in a non-ideal box. These messages then trickle into our media, schools, family, and communities, where we pick up these implicit and explicit messages without realizing it. This is why Asian American/Pacific Islanders face perpetual questions about their foreignness, and black men are viewed as threats or dangerous because their skin color is outside the white norm and deemed less than. And of course, this social construction of race is wholly unjust and unfair. So it's important to, 1, keep in mind that race is not helpful as a social construction, and 2, recognize and understand that racism really exists based on perceptions of what your race or the race of others might be. Long story short, race can be a pretty inaccurate social construction to describe who you really are. But your perceived race and the race you perceive of others matters a lot in society because of white supremacy. And that is what racism ultimately is: the construction of races from particular biological characteristics people have, and the use of this construction to lift up certain groups in society into a dominant class and keep other groups in a lower, oppressed class. The system of racism is such that all people in the societies in which racism exists are affected by it. This is also why this book is written for everyone, those who are disadvantaged under white supremacy and those who benefit from it. The reality is, we all suffer under white supremacy and racism, and we all have the power to heal that suffering too. Healing from Racism, a daring proposition. Each chapter of this workbook will take you step by step through a given strategy of healing from racism. Each step will relate to you no matter what your racial identity is. This workbook is for people of color and white people to engage in racial healing strategies alongside one another. There may be ways you diverge in your exploration of healing from racism if you are a person of color or white, but along the way you get to take a peek into what another individual from a different social identity or subject position might be doing to foster their part of healing from the pain and wounds of racism. For instance, both people of color and white folks internalize racism that may be easy or challenging to recognize. Yet there is a distinct difference in how this happens. If you are a person of color, you have internalized negative messages and beliefs about your race, and if you are white, you have internalized a sense of dominance related to your race. Why did I want to address both white folks and folks of color together in the same workbook? Well, I myself grew up with a lot of the racial complexities we will talk about in this book. My mom was white, and her family had immigrated to the land we now call the United States multiple generations ago. My dad was a Sikh, turban-wearing guy who emigrated from India in the 1950s. In retrospect, as their mixed-race child, I saw so many missed opportunities for my mom and dad to talk about how racism influenced their relationship. For instance, I never heard how my mom felt about the racism she saw my dad experience because of his dark skin, turban, and immigrant status. I also never got to hear how he felt when she was silent about the racism she saw him and our family experience. Because my parents were in the throes of experiencing racism as an interracial couple and didn't quite have the words to talk about what was happening to them, I also didn't know what I was experiencing when it came to the system of racism and the messages I was learning about what it meant to be white or a person of color. So after these experiences surrounding race in my family, I set about on a healing journey myself. I learned that healing from racism wasn't a one-time thing, a few workshops to attend, or even a counselor's office to frequent. I learned that healing from racism comprised several important healing strategies to keep engaging with over time. I pursued training in counseling and psychology, immersing myself in studies by leading multicultural scholars on race, including Daryl Wing Sue, who wrote the afterword in this book, looking for more specifics on the harm that occurs from racism. I knew what racism felt like when I experienced it, because even when it was subtle, I could feel it in my bones. I also reconnected with racial justice movements I had been involved in and fellow activists I had shared space with, including my friend Tim Wise, who also wrote the foreword to this book. In doing all of this, I not only became more educated about the empirical studies and racial justice movements detailing what racism is, but I also dug deep into how racism personally impacted me in multiple areas of my life and as a human being. And I adopted a recovery mindset. I realized I might not be able to save the world from racism, but I was going to identify ways I had internalized racist ideas and stereotypes about the world. Part of this recovery, including identifying ways I could act differently when I encountered racism in day-to-day life, so as to be genuinely anti-racist, and perhaps inspire others to do the same. In the process, I found that adopting this intentional recovery framework, where I was engaging individual strategies of healing, such as learning about my cultural background and racial identity, and working for racial justice, gave me the best chance of healing from the harm racism did to me. Now, if you're a person of color, you likely have firsthand knowledge of and experience with how racism looks and feels. You are likely the target of racism, and you may experience overt, in-your-face acts of racial discrimination and prejudice, such as being called a racial epithet or not having your job application reviewed because you have an ethnic name. In addition, as a person of color, you may experience a range of everyday indignities of racism, which Daryl Wing Sue calls microaggressions. These microaggressions, such as Asian American people being asked where they are from, as if they were not born in the U.S., can add up over time. Ultimately, as a person of color, you can get boxed into stereotypes that have nothing to do with who you actually are, which then puts you at risk for internalizing these stereotypes and believing they are true. Because of these racialized stereotypes, you may be tokenized as the only person of color in your school or community, perhaps leading you to believe you have to be overly conscious of being a good representative of your race. The effects of racism may be less clear for you if you are white. Paul Kivel, a white anti-racist author, says, "White folks indeed benefit from having advantages based on their skin color. Because of these advantages you have if you are white, you can be participating in racism even if it is not overt, because you have internalized these advantages as being normal experiences that everyone has. For instance, because you are white, you don't have to experience being called a racial epithet or employment discrimination. However, as white anti-racist Frances Kendall says, there is a cost you as a white person pay for being part of a system of racism, whether you know it or not. When it comes to talking about our challenging racism, you can often feel shame, guilt, apathy, and an internalized sense of dominance, and get frozen in these emotions so you can't talk or act. As a white person, you are likely to have lost your connection to your ethnic group, for example, Italian, Irish, or Russian. You may know little about your cultural backgrounds and histories. Furthermore, activists like Tim Wise describe the losses white people have in terms of the opportunity to learn a full history of society that includes the achievements of people of color, and why it is so important to interrogate whiteness so your perspective of the world is not as limited. This interrogation includes learning not only to relate to the wide variety of racial groups that exist, but also how white privilege disconnects you from your own cultural background and how you can act to challenge racism. So again, whether you are a person of color or white, there are many inaccurate messages you can pick up from the world about who you are and who other races are. This workbook is all about taking action to develop strategies you can use to begin the journey of healing from racism. A guide for your journey, the Racial Healing Wheel. Take a look at the Racial Healing Wheel. Each spoke of the wheel, or pie slice, represents a healing strategy you can use in your journey of recovery. Each chapter in this workbook explores one of these healing strategies and contains exercises and techniques you can learn to use to educate, inform, liberate, and transform yourself to bring that aspect of racial healing into your everyday life. Here is a brief description of each chapter. 1. Know your racial identity. Explore what you know about your racial identity and what you were taught or not taught about race and racism. 2. Explore your internalized racism. Identify belief systems about race and racism that aren't yours, and develop new and more helpful thoughts and feelings. 3. Relearn the history of racism. Discover new knowledge and gain a new understanding about racism and how this system of oppression works. 4. Grieve and name racism. Acknowledge the stages of grief that come with more awareness, learning, and action on racism. 5. Raise your race consciousness. Learn how to act more consciously as a racial being and be a positive influence on others to do the same. 6. Catch yourself in the flow of racism. Understand that racism can arise in spontaneous and unexpected ways, and develop skills to interrupt these instances. 7. Understand racism in relationships. Recognize how racism plays out in interpersonal relationships across a variety of settings and learn to identify when it is happening. 8. Reclaim your whole racial self. Honor the ways you have changed and the authenticity that comes with individual racial healing. 9. Be a racial ally. Learn ways you can help others and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?